Hello, Super Savers. I hope you're doing well. What a start to November we've had. New I-bond rate, another 75 basis point rate hike at the latest Fed meeting, and big guys like the Fed and China shedding some of their US Treasury securities from their balance sheets. What does all this mean for super savers like you and me who've bought, are buying, and or thinking of buying T-bills? What's my T-bill strategy for the next 6 to 12 months in light of all this? Let's dive in and find out. So that you guys don't have to watch the entire 45-minute press conference, here are my 3 key takeaways from the Fed's November 2nd meeting. 1. The Fed will continue to raise rates until inflation is brought back down to their 2% goal. Powell mentioned this goal of a 2% inflation rate about 7 times in the first 7 minutes of the meeting alone.
My colleagues and I are strongly committed to bringing inflation back down to our 2% goal. 2%, 2%, 2%, 2%, 2%, 2%.
You get the picture. It seems that right now there's no stopping rate hikes or Powell. Getting to this 2% though may take some time. 2. Overall rates may go above the Fed's original targets, primarily because inflation is still higher than expected and the labor market stronger than expected.
Incoming data since our last meeting suggests that the ultimate level of interest rates will be higher than previously expected.
3. The Fed may slow down the pace of rate increases, or not, but it does not look like they will pause rate increases entirely. As you can see from the meeting transcript, Powell says this outright. At some point, it will become appropriate to slow the pace of increases as we approach the level of interest rates that will be sufficiently restrictive to bring inflation down to our 2% goal. Some hopefuls cheered this on as a signal that the next rate hike may come down to 50 basis points. But we read it a bit differently because Powell wraps this thought up with,
"We will continue to make our decisions meeting by meeting and communicate our thinking as clearly as possible."
Our interpretation? No one knows, including Powell, I suspect, given the amount of flexibility he gives the Fed in the clip that we just showed. Perhaps the Fed will slow rate hikes down to 50 basis points, or maybe they'll raise it by 100 basis points, depending on what the data shows. What is clear is that rates will keep going up, which is good news for us T-bill fans who are laddering and are buying new issue T-bills in the coming months. Now, let's talk about what doesn't necessarily bode so well for Treasuries. While the Fed and China have different reasons for getting rid of some of the US Treasuries they own, the end result of these sales for you and me is the same, in that it will directly impact one specific group of Treasury buyers and or owners in our super saver community. Let's first try to understand what the Fed is doing, then we'll move on to China, and afterwards to what this means for us super savers and our T-bills. So here's another point that Powell repeats often in the November 2nd Fed meeting.
In addition, we're continuing the process of significantly reducing the size of our balance sheet.
Meaning they're offloading some of the Treasury securities they hold, most of which, as you can see from this chart, were purchased by the Fed during the pandemic to help stimulate the economy. At its peak during the pandemic, the Fed owned more than $6 trillion of federal debt, meaning US Treasury securities only. As of November 2nd, 2022, the Fed's Treasury holdings have already come down to $5.6 trillion as a result of their balance sheet reduction efforts. But why are they running down their stock of federal debt? So, as we've been seeing, one of the ways that the Fed can battle inflation is by raising interest rates. But there is another way for the Fed to control inflation as well. They can encourage or discourage spending by increasing or decreasing the money supply, respectively, meaning on the most basic level by putting money in or taking money out of circulation in our economy. This illustration, because we love illustrations, this illustration shows how the Fed can stimulate the economy by buying US Treasuries, like it did during the pandemic. When the Fed buys Treasuries from banks in the open market, the Fed pays for the Treasuries it acquires like you and I would. They deposit cash into the selling bank's accounts. But unlike us super savers who have to earn our money before we buy our T-bills, the Fed can simply pay the banks with new money that they print, or more likely these days, create electronically. As a result, when the Fed pays with new money they just created, the banks overall have more money to lend to their customers, so they'll lower interest rates to attract more borrowers, which encourages individuals, companies, and the government to borrow more money to spend and or invest. And this increased spending and or investment helps to stimulate and grow the economy. When the Fed buys Treasuries from banks in the open market, this also increases liquidity in the Treasury market. Or in other words, there's more demand for Treasuries, which pushes up Treasury security prices and lowers their yields. That's what happens when the Fed stimulates the economy, which, as I mentioned a bit earlier, was what they did during COVID. And that's how they ended up with all this debt, and how our economy ended up with a lot more cash in circulation than before. Right now, the Fed is trying not to stimulate the economy. In fact, they want to do the opposite. They want to pull back consumer and business spending and investment to bring inflation down. And to do that, they're raising rates, but they're also shrinking the money supply. The Fed is doing what's analogous to selling US Treasuries and keeping the money they get from the buyers of these Treasuries in their own coffers, thereby taking the cash out of circulation. Here's how the Fed can contract the economy by selling US Treasuries. When the Fed sells Treasuries to the banks in the open market, the buying banks have to take cash out of their own accounts to pay the Fed. That's how cash is pulled out of circulation in the US economy. As a result, the banks have less money to lend to their customers, so they'll increase interest rates due to tighter money supply. Higher interest rates means individuals, companies, and ultimately the government as well, if it acts responsibly, will borrow less money to spend and or invest, which is exactly what is happening now for the most part. This decreases spending and or investment and causes the economy to contract, the goal that the Fed is currently working towards. And when the Fed sells Treasuries to the banks in the open market, this also decreases the liquidity in the Treasury market. There's a greater supply of Treasuries, more Treasuries on sale, which lowers Treasury security prices and pushes up their yields. One thing to note though, in our current situation, the Fed is not actually selling US Treasuries to banks in the open market. They're simply letting the existing debt that's on their balance sheet mature and not replacing it with new debt. Here's how the Fed's letting Treasuries mature without replacing them has the same effect as selling them in the open market. When the US Treasuries on the Fed's balance sheet mature, the Fed gets repaid cash by the government for these securities. The Fed keeps the cash in its coffer. It doesn't spend the money it receives to buy new debt to replace the mature debt. When the Fed retires cash from circulation like this, there's less money in the system, just like when the Fed sells US Treasuries. And similarly, banks will have to increase interest on their loans to adjust to tighter monetary conditions. Individuals, businesses, and at some point also the government will borrow, spend, and or invest less, and the economy contracts. Likewise, with the Fed not stepping in to buy new debt to replace the mature debt, liquidity will decline. There's less demand for Treasuries, which lowers Treasury security prices and increases Treasury yields. And that's why the Fed is offloading US Treasuries from its balance sheet. Now, to make matters even more complicated and maybe a bit worse, let's talk about China, and then we'll talk about how all this US Treasury dumping impacts us super saving T-bill fans and what my strategy is to deal with it. At the end of August 2022, China owned a bit less than $1 trillion of total US debt outstanding. And while this sounds like, and actually is, an astonishingly large number, the overall size of our federal debt means that China owns only about 3% of the approximate $31 trillion of total US Treasuries outstanding. This little gray sliver here. This diamond NestEgg yellow rectangle here represents the $23.4 trillion of US Treasuries owned by American companies, organizations, and individuals, including the amounts owned by the Fed that we just talked about. Basically, about 76%. And this non-diamond NestEgg yellow here represents the $6.5 trillion of US Treasury securities held by foreign companies, organizations, and individuals, other than China, so about 21%. This debt is often held by other foreign governments like Japan and the UK. By the way, Japan is currently the largest foreign holder of US debt, ahead of China in second place. So why has China dumped US Treasuries in recent months? In short, we think out of self-interest to defend their currency, the yuan, against the dollar. Most of us know how strong the dollar is currently. All well and good for us here, but not necessarily for the yuan. As you can see from this chart of the US dollar to the Chinese yuan over the past year, you need more and more yuan to buy $1 US. In the beginning of 2022, you had to pay about 6.4 yuan for every $1. Now, you have to pay nearly 7.3 yuan for every dollar, or 14% more. Now, the Chinese government seems to want to stimulate the yuan and limit its devaluation. The way to do this is to create more demand for the yuan. So the Chinese government is basically buying up yuan in the market to drive up its price, or at least slow the depreciation. And what's the Chinese government using to buy up the yuan? US dollars, that's what. And to get these US dollars that they need to do this, they have to sell some of the US Treasuries they own. So, the Fed is dumping US Treasuries, China is dumping US Treasuries, and it looks like both of them will go on doing this for a while. How does this impact super saving T-bill fans in our community? And what's my T-bill strategy for the next 6 to 12 months? Here's what I'm going to do. Keep buying and laddering new T-bills every 4 weeks. Because, well, Powell basically told me to. Not privately, of course, but with his November 2nd message that the Fed will continue to raise interest rates in the short to medium term. Now, whether we're sticking with our 13-week T-bill ladder or moving to a 17-week one, well, that's this week's dinner conversation. I'll update all of you on how that turns out in another video in the coming weeks. But just out of curiosity, what does your T-bill ladder look like? Drop me and the other super savers a comment below so we can all compare notes. Some of you have asked about why I'm focusing on the shorter maturity T-bills. When the latest 17-week T-bill auctions off at an investment rate of 4.402%, why would I buy any of these longer term notes that are paying less? Having said that, everyone's financial journey is different. If you are buying treasury notes and bonds right now, also drop us a note below and share your investment strategy with us. And do keep in mind, all the investment rates I just showed you from the recent treasury auctions are annualized and subject to federal income tax, unfortunately. So here's what I'm not going to do. I'm not selling my T-bills before maturity. And here's why. We've already established that the Fed is reducing its treasury holdings, that China is reducing its treasury holdings. And don't forget other countries like Japan and the UK. They're US friendly, but they may also have to sell US Treasuries at some point to prop up their own currency against a strong dollar, just like China. And while the Fed and these countries have different reasons for selling US Treasuries, the result is the same, as I mentioned earlier in the video, and it specifically impacts one group of Treasury buyers and or owners, and that group is those who currently own or are planning to buy T-bills with the intention of selling before maturity into the secondary market. More sellers, less buyers in the Treasury market means declining liquidity in the Treasury market. Or, put another way, if you want to or have to sell your Treasuries before maturity in the secondary market, the price you get could be much less than you had imagined because all these big guys are also trying to sell, which has the impact of pushing down the price you'll get even further. And listen, if you do have to sell, say you need cash from your Treasuries for an emergency or property taxes or even other bills, then you have to sell. The option is there. Just know that when you have to sell into a market where liquidity is tight, the price you'll get will be lower than in normal times. And, or you may have to wait longer than expected to find a buyer. One more thing worth mentioning, there is some talk amongst fearmongers about the Treasury market drying up completely, meaning there's a standstill, no buyers, no sellers, and how this would be the ultimate threat to financial stability around the world. And I agree, it would be the ultimate threat to global financial stability, but that's also why I don't think it will happen. Again, just my perspective as someone that will keep building out my T-bill portfolio and eventually, potentially, add in some longer-term notes and or bonds. Could the liquidity situation in the Treasury market get worse? Yes. Could it get much worse even? Possibly. But as I said, I'm holding to maturity. I'm not selling into the secondary market. So this really doesn't keep me up at night. More importantly, it seems Powell has come a long way since deeming inflation transitory in 2021. Transitory, the word that broke the camel's back. Anyway, the Powell we see now seems determined to not be that guy who'll go down in history books as having broken the US economy by not bringing down inflation aggressively enough. And after watching the entirety of the November 2nd press conference, I'm also relatively confident he's equally determined to not be that guy who'll go down in history books as having broken the US Treasury market and brought an end to global financial stability in the 2020 decade. So like his commitment to bringing inflation down to the target rate of 2%, if liquidity in the Treasury market does dry up to a point where it seems the Fed needs to step in, my expectation is that they will step in some way, somehow. Maybe they'll buy back some older illiquid Treasuries in the open market. Maybe they'll start buying new Treasuries again. Or maybe they'll exempt Treasuries from balance sheet regulations like they did during the pandemic. Who knows? The point is, there's a lot of different levers the Fed can pull to keep the Treasury market from becoming totally illiquid. Let me tell you, I'd love to be a fly on their wall during these Fed meetings right now. Well, T-bill fans, that was a lot of good stuff for you, I hope. So on my to-do list now is to check on those recent auction results and next announcement dates before my dinner conversation on the 13 versus 17-week T-bill ladder. Check out this video here if you're interested in seeing what my T-bill ladder looks like at the moment. As always, stay tuned for the latest developments during these fascinating times. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that thumbs up and see you again soon with another exciting wealth building video.